Good morning, class. I'm getting right after it. We just broke from our time together in class today, and I wanted to take a little time to put some closing or some finishing touches on the conversation and presentation that I began today. And as you'll recall, we're talking about the French Revolution, and I assigned to you this weekend a documentary that sort of, I think, does an effective job of going through essentially the story of the French Revolution and the steps by which the frustrated peasant class and lower middle class throughout France was brought to enough of a frustration that reached a critical mass that prompted unrest, and unrest prompted change, and through a string of events, France becomes a new place. And really not just France, but as we see in the aftermath during the era of Napoleonic France, as Napoleon seeks to export the significance of the French Revolution to larger portions of Europe, this really does become a continent-wide phenomenon. So the French Revolution rightfully belongs in this very important conversation about changes that are happening in the world in the late 18th century that effectively help set the stage or build the foundation for the modern world that follows thereafter. So this is our objective for today. It was on the board, and I'm going to try to be efficient here. We talked about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. If you want any more time with these slides, of course you can pause them. And specifically what we're looking at, again, is how France and Europe are different as a result of the French Revolution. So I talked about consequence 1 in class. I'm going to skip through that here. And we left off with consequence number 2. And that is equality of all before the law. And this, of course, it's almost difficult to impress upon members of our present generation that this would even be a noteworthy accomplishment, because we sort of take it for granted that, of course, there's just one set of law, that's the law of the land, and we're all equally bound by it, so on and so forth. But as I started to mention in class today, this is actually a dramatic new difference. It was pretty amazing the way in which the peasant classes and the lower middle class, the working class of France in the late 1700s was very much taken advantage of and exploited in what we would, at least that's how we would refer to it today. So some of these gains that come are dramatic and noteworthy. And we mentioned the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which also was responsible for ending privilege, but it also declares that the law of France ought to apply equally to all. And the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was drafted in the immediate aftermath of the tennis court oath, when all of those frustrated members of the Third Estate walked out and essentially formed their own assembly, the National Assembly. And the main purpose of the tennis court oath was that this National Assembly would be formed, and the National Assembly would remain intact until such time as a new constitution could be drafted for France. Now, it takes a while. That constitution will not be put in place until 1791, but the constitution also further solidifies this commitment to a single set of laws. And we'll see actually how Napoleon, later on in his Napoleonic Code, he is also going to take a single set of laws and try to impress it not just upon France, but also upon those parts of Europe that Napoleon and his men reach out, spread out, and conquer. For a brief period of time, Napoleon and France are going to have a very powerful, bold footprint across the European landmass. Consequence 3, this is a depiction of Maximilien Robespierre. Another consequence is that the French Revolution shows the limits of radicalism. As you saw in the documentary, there are so many moving parts, moving so dramatically, quite frankly, scarily, right? I mean, heads are rolling down the streets of Paris, quite literally, with the guillotine. The tenor and the decision making within the French Revolution is very fast. It's no surprise that midway through the French Revolution, the revolutionaries themselves start to become fearful for their lives, because what was revolutionary behavior yesterday starts to seem pretty conservative by today, meaning the target is constantly changing, and Robespierre is introducing dramatic changes in very short order, and this proves problematic and scary for large segments of French society. A good example of this, your textbook mentions briefly, was that the revolutionaries required of the priestly class, so the second estate, I'm sorry, actually the first estate, as we discussed in class today, but the revolutionaries require that even the priests swear primary allegiance to the state. And this, of course, is a very interesting and controversial decision. Priests generally, by definition, are people whose primary loyalty and allegiance lies with their faith, and in this case, the Catholic Church. And so even peasants who are frustrated with the way things were in France, even peasants are really concerned about this idea that the radicals who are leading the French Revolution are insisting upon rather absurd things, some of which really cut against the basic sensibilities of the French people. So this is probably an example, one of many, where the revolutionaries go too far and they breed something of a backlash. Second, similarly, the cult of the supreme being is one of the rather bizarre chapters of the French Revolution. Once again, Maximilien Robespierre puts forth this idea that essentially the highest calling of the individual is their service to the state. Robespierre isn't quite willing to go so far as to be atheist or to suggest that God doesn't exist, but he does suggest that the highest expression of one's devotion to God comes in their participation and their behavior as the ideal citizen of the state. And there emerged sort of a number of like secular religious associations, again, that start to, for the average French person who's not as well educated or as articulate as Robespierre, these things start to seem a little bit odd. Another reform that goes through that is pretty radical, not just pretty radical, it's quite radical, is the calendar. For a period of about a decade, France adopts a calendar that changes almost everything as it had been. So the French start to have 10-day weeks. They redraft the periods of the day so that an hour is now 144 minutes. And this is all an effort at making it a decimal system of time. So a second actually starts to be 0.086, no, let's see, 0.86 of a actual second. So seconds actually get shortened. And all the idea is that this will sort of put together a more reasonable calendar that is keeping with the decimal system. A very complicated chain of events that transforms everyday practical function of society in significant ways. And then finally, the Reign of Terror from 1892 to 1894. The tenor of the revolution is dramatically increased. In fairness, people like Robespierre and other leaders of the revolution are afraid that they're losing their grip. Other countries in Europe are declaring war against France. And so what happens is there's like something akin to martial law declared by the revolutionaries. And so tolerance for behavior that might cut against the interests of the revolution is dramatically reduced. Harsh punishments in very short order are meted out against French people who are believed to be going against the revolution. So it's during the Reign of Terror where the guillotine, thousands of people might be put to death on a given day, and all of this shows how radical and scary the revolution was, and it creates support for, I should say it undermines support for the revolution itself. Okay, consequence 4, freedom versus security. People like their freedom, and they want to generally have as much of it as possible. But if freedom comes at the cost of security and confidence in your everyday well-being, that oftentimes one's interest in freedom might clearly be reduced. So again, the practice of executions becomes scary. Here we have a picture. This is a French painting. This is Robespierre. These are fellow leaders in France, although at this point Robespierre has been shot in the jaw, as you saw at the beginning of the documentary yesterday. He is in his final hours of life before he will be put to death by the guillotine. But this is a pretty fitting example of how quickly one's fortunes could turn during the French Revolution. Here we have Robespierre, who was once the most powerful leader, running afoul or running amok of his fellow revolutionaries and leaders within France, and this of course is going to have tremendous consequences for him. All of the people in France are sacrificing as a result of the revolution. Food is in short supply, soldiers are fighting on the battlefield in remote places, oftentimes outside of France. There does not seem to be any quick or easy solution or fix in sight. So over time, people grow a little tired. The failure of the revolutionaries to deliver what the French people had hoped for, which was a new day and a better day that's at least slow to materialize. During the Reign of Terror, the Committee of Public Safety is set up, and it rules with a very iron hand. So the people aren't necessarily seeing many of the freedoms and liberties that documents like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and the Constitution, they aren't seeing the immediate delivery of these promises. I mentioned here Edmund Burke. This is a painting of Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was a famous British political philosopher, and not long after the French Revolution, Burke undertook to describe and explain why the American Revolution was much more successful than the French Revolution in terms of accomplishing what it set out to do. And essentially, Burke's thesis is simply this, that people are okay with change. People will accept change, but they will not accept dramatic change. And he said one of the true accomplishments of the American Revolution is that the American revolutionaries weren't trying to change that much about American society. They were just trying to throw off the ruling class from Great Britain. But after they threw off the ruling class of Great Britain, they adopted a society that was actually quite similar to the one that had existed before it, just with a slightly different governmental system in place. And in the French Revolution, Burke argued, by contrast, people were advocating and changing widespread aspects of society, and that was the failure. You can think of like a scientific experiment. If you have too many variables in play, it's hard to know what is changing and what is improving things. And so in this case, Burke said the French Revolution was doomed because it tried to do too much too quickly, and that's fundamentally incompatible with human nature. Lastly, I'll just say nationalism was a very important consequence here. And essentially, Europe responded to the French Revolution, and in the course of this, people developed their own national identities.